We need some like elevator music during this part, huh? We're waiting for folks to come in. We need a theme song. Wonder what the Jenkins theme song would be. Mr. Belvedere. That's what it is. Yeah.
That's a good
That's what
idea.
I always think of when I see that. So tell me, Brandon, how'd you come up with the title?
It's a good question. So Jenkins is a very popular tool. You hear it a lot when people start talking about continuous integration. And we'll talk more about, I guess my history and your history with Jenkins. But I think today for most people, it's not the right thing to learn about or to even start with. So that's where free, fast, and foolish came from. And it's a little tongue in cheek.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, we're not calling anyone fools. This will come out in the discussion too. I think it can just be a little fickle sometimes to start here, and I think for certain situations it makes sense. But I think our vision of what CI can bring to modernize embedded is a lot larger than maybe typical implementations that we see and that we help people mature from. So yeah, cool.
Okay, let's get started. I'm Brandon Laren. I work at Dojo 5 with Joe Schneider on a product called EmbedOps. We'll talk a little bit about EmbedOps, but mostly this is going to be about CI in general and CI tools like Jenkins.
Yeah, and I'm Joe Schneider. I'm president and founder at D5 and an embedded hardware nerd.
So about 20 years ago, cruise control was the first CI system that I was exposed to. Joe exposed me to cruise control, and I thought it was a really cool tool. We'll talk more about CI and all of this kind of in general, but it was a web application. We were working on an embedded product with like 50 developers, and we wanted to know if things were building correctly. And Joe showed me this tool. He already had it running and everything. So I was like, this is really awesome. And then I started learning more, and I was like, what is this Tomcat thing that I need to learn about? So part of the fun, I guess, of the side project that we had from our embedded day jobs was learning about Java application server like Tomcat. And then also when we started to hit errors, Joe was like, here, this is Maven. You can use Maven to build this and we can fix this bug. And I was like, I don't want to do this. I want to write C code. I want to figure out how to make I want to figure out how to make a tractor drive autonomously. I don't really care about Java development.
Or care to do it.
Yeah. So I guess one of the things that we're going to talk about is how much control over your CI tool you have. And the tool Cruise Control, which ThoughtWorks says was the first continuous integration server, we had lots of control. We had the source code, it was open source, and it worked most of the time, and it was a super valuable tool 20 years ago. And Joe taught me about some Java development.
It was because I think what had happened is Cruise Control had a lot of, I don't think it had as broad of a plugin structure as Jenkins has today, but it had some plugin type of thing. And at the time where Brandon and I were working, we were using a horrific VCS tool called StarTeam. Is kind of like Subversion, where there's a central server. This is before the times when the dinosaurs were living, and we were all using centralized version control. Luckily somehow some poor sap had written a cruise control plugin for StarTeam, and that was kind of a not like, if it hadn't had that, it would have been a non-starter, and I don't know how we would have moved. I don't know that this would have ever happened in our old gig. But somehow some poor sap had realized cruise control and Star Team, I need to make them work together, and they had written a Java a plugin for cruise control at that moment. But we were in the Java code because there was a problem with I forget what it was, but it was like the API had changed from Star Team from version to version or something, and there was just there was some kind of maybe assumption in the Java code. Do you remember exactly what it was, Brandon, that we had to fix?
I don't.
Oh,
I remember it was a very small change that we had to make, and then figure out how the whole build system worked for the tool.
But we were Java idiots. I'll call myself that. I think hopefully you'll accept that title too.
Yes.
And and we were like, okay, like all we want is like this thing to automatically build, and we understood the value of CI, but we were all of a sudden we found ourselves knee deep in Tomcat. I mean, we even configuring Tomcat, which is think of it like if you're not familiar with what Tomcat is, I don't even know if it's around anymore, if it's still a thing, if people use it, but it's like if you have a Java app and you could zip up Java apps and deploy them as WAR files. And then you would deploy the WAR file using Tomcat. So Tomcat was like a web server kind of for a Java app, and you could just kind of plop a Java app in there and then it would serve it out. But we had to mess with like the Tomcat like memory settings for how much memory was being used because our build was kind of big, and there was just a bunch of maintenance and mess. And we found ourselves deep in Java code and Maven, and like how do we rebuild cruise control? I mean, and like you said, it was a great place to start. It was better than starting from scratch for sure. And I'm really impressed that you found a screenshot, even though it's a little fuzzy, of cruise control. I don't know where you dug that out of, but
that's on SourceForge. You can still go to SourceForge and get cruise control. Yeah.
Oh, nice. Yep. Wow. Well, maybe we should spin it up for old time's sake. Anyway, this is a great story to start with, because that was kind of we powered through it. We were passionate and excited enough to get this going. We saw the value. But it was a slog.
Yep, for sure. So that was kind of my first, and I guess it had to have been our first CI tool, since ThoughtWorks says it's the first continuous integration server. At that same job at a Fortune 500 company, I later went on to manage a team that was managing about 20 Jenkins masters or main servers, along with all of the teams. We supported about 500 developers worldwide, and had a lot of fun figuring out how to operate a web application. And make sure it worked well enough for people to do their daily job with. So a lot of fun times I've had, and seeing Jenkins grow up, from Hudson, and then the name change to Jenkins, and all of the changes that have kind of made it into, I'll say, a modern CI system, but one that you have a lot of control over. And we'll talk more about that for sure. But I guess the net for me, and we'll talk about this again at the end, is that today I wouldn't spin up pretty much in any company a Jenkins system like that, where we were operating it, because of some of the things we'll talk about. So stepping back a little bit, we jumped right into the first CI system ever, so the cruise control, and talked a little bit about Jenkins. But why do we need a CI system? So this is kind of the canonical XP programming diagram. I'm not going to walk through all of this, but if you look over to the far right on the diagram, it says small releases. And one of the big things in Agile and a lot of modern software development is taking the work that you're doing and getting it into smaller pieces and getting it all the way through your system and getting feedback on it as far out as you can, because you reduce your risk to your schedule. You reduce your risk that you made something that actually, the business people or your actual customers really wanted, and that's useful to people. And I guess probably the big thing for me is those small pieces make me feel good. So like if we can get small pieces and show progress instead of, just a huge chunk of work that's kind of done, it makes me feel a lot better. So when you're doing that, a lot of those things over to the left in the diagram are giving you feedback, signals on whether that small release can be, pushed out farther or not. So a CI system is really a way to take all of those pieces of feedback and put them all together, get a report out of it, and make sure that you've checked your boxes that you've set up to say, is this releasable? So continuous integration, there's lots of different definitions for it. I like this one. We kind of already talked about this, but we keep our latest code ready to release. So that means kind of two things for me. One is that the work that's being done by an individual developer is getting merged with everybody else's work in trunk or main, whatever it is, in one branch. The more you're doing that at a daily basis, the more continuous integration you're doing. And kind of along with that, to enable that, you need that feedback, and you need that feedback fast to know that you can merge all that stuff together. It's just a train wreck if your system isn't telling you that you can put your code with Joe's code, because I trust Joe's code because he's got a lot of feedback signals like tests or static analysis, lots of different things that you can, understand your system with. So how often are you merging, and how often are you getting feedback, and how fast is that feedback allows you to do those small batch releases? And that's continuous integration. So this big old pretty chart here is from the web world. This is a Grafana chart, and really it's not so much a chart on your development and your release. This is a more of an operational chart, but I wanted to pull this up because to me this is an example of you're getting a lot of signals here on operating your system. And this is like a very typical thing you see in the web world, is that all of the data from your running system gets pumped into something, and then you're able to visualize it, get notifications for it. Joe and I were talking about AI right before this. There's lots of companies that look at all of these signals and try to tell you if something bad's going to happen. I try to think about the CI system that you're using for development as very similar. You're getting signals from lots of different places, little pieces of feedback that you should be listening to. So in the embedded space, when you're developing, what does this feedback look like? I put a few things up here, like simply, does it compile? Does it compile and link? Does it functionally work? This could be, manual tests, automated tests. There's a lot of tools out there for static analysis. Some of them are very simple. Some of them, like Clockwork, are, very involved. And then all the way out to, can I put my release onto the device and it boots, and it, basically all those same functional tests. Those are just examples of feedback that you can get. And really, I'm going to come back to that idea of we keep our latest code ready to release. So what are the signals that are being used by your team today to know if you're ready to release? And then start thinking about how fast can you get those signals to your developers, to your, to the business, to anybody who's looking at it. Looking at that list, Joe, what did I miss for signals that you've seen people use?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, there's what you want to know is, all of my quality checks that are in my pipeline, and it's both, functional quality, but business quality. You hear about validation verification, right? So that's, V&V is some acronym some folks will be familiar with, and that's kind of the same idea, right? You want to make ultimately, if it does the thing you meant it to do, and if users agree that it solves their problem, that's kind of the ultimate goal. And of course, we can't directly test for that in a lot of cases, so you have to drive it down to the proxies that we use, things like dynamic analysis, static analysis, or even things like did somebody sneak some GPL code into my proprietary code base?
Right.
There are tools out there that'll, scan your code base for license violations and stuff. Or do I have a security vulnerability in my firmware software? And how can I scan for that? And, somebody accidentally bring in an old version or has a library that we've been using for 2 years. Like only recently we found the community or the world, a maintainer of that library found an issue with it. They've released a patch, but we weren't aware. And so then, finding that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of different things that I think ultimately can jeopardize your verification, validation, both your functional and non-functional requirements. And you like I need to have a secure system. It needs to boot properly. It needs to a lot of the hardware in the loop stuff, that I guess is also important from integration testing perspective. All of that is all feedback, and it's really the name of the game here is like as early as I could find that from the moment we have an issue with our device to the moment I know that there's an issue with my device, I'm aware of it. That's you want to shorten that feedback cycle as much as possible, and then you want the tools in place so that you can make the fix. Fix the issue, whatever it is, very quickly, and then have confidence after that the fix has been made properly and you're back to releasable again.
Yeah, no, those are great points. We've kind of been implying this, but really there are manual parts, I think, in everybody's process that you're getting feedback on your product that, and at least in the embedded space, there's almost always manual steps that are happening. In the web world, there are, teams that make a change and it goes through their automated testing and it gets pushed all the way out to the web application. And it gets very complicated out there. I mean, you can do partial rollouts, all kinds of stuff, but that doesn't happen as much in the embedded space. But
yet,
I guess, yeah. My point here is that you are going to automate those pieces, and we're still kind of stepping close to your CI system and what it's supposed to be doing. So like Jenkins, that sort of thing. But these individual pieces of feedback that you're getting, those are very important. And it's kind of somewhat separate from your CI server itself. I've seen a lot of teams that have an automated build, for example, a build script that gets run at your desk, but nobody is running it regularly. It's not built independently or anything. So they have automated feedback and automated build or automated tests, but it's not really a part of a CI system, for example. Actually, one of my first professional jobs, one of my first tasks, I was given kind of this component and I was told, yeah, there's a bunch of automated tests for it. So we think it's pretty much ready. Just go check it out. And I went and looked at it, and yeah, there were a lot of automated tests, but they didn't compile. And once I got them to compile, they didn't actually pass. So there was automation at some point, but they weren't getting regular feedback on that automation, and it fell out of use. So I think that's kind of my step into. There's the concept and practice of continuous integration. And there is the feedback that you're getting from your automated builds, automated things that are giving you feedback. And now we have our CI server that's actually going to coordinate you getting that feedback on a regular cadence. And so it's going to do the thing that Joe talked about earlier with cruise control. It's going to integrate with your version control. It pretty much has to. Every system is going to do that. A lot of times it's going to see, you made changes on a certain branch. So now I need to go execute something that you've defined, and it's going to give you some reports and it's going to give you some notifications. Back in the day, those notifications were like emails, or, you could go out to the web application. A lot of times today we see things like Slack and, other tools like that where it's sending those notifications to. So the CI server, like Jenkins, like cruise control before it, is doing all of those things. And it's, you can use, I guess, pieces of a CI server that are outside of that, but the basics of a CI server are pretty well understood, and they pretty much all are going to do it. And we'll talk about Jenkins and some other ones, but I kind of think about this as a supersized cron job. So, it's really only taking what you've already automated, running it, giving you a place to dump some reports, and it's got some hooks in it for notifications. And as I've used different CI systems, all of those things that I was just talking about are very important, and it's pretty much covered on all of them. So let's talk specifically about Jenkins. So Jenkins is a CI server. We talked about cruise control as a Java web application. Jenkins is also a Java web application. It's pretty easy to set up. You can go to their website, and there's different ways to run it. If you're going to run it for like a large team, you wouldn't use the easy ways to set it up. But if you just want to get it running on your computer or on one computer, it's pretty easy to set up. It is open source, so that's cool. You can go be a part of that community and know you're supporting lots of people, because lots of people do use Jenkins. There's a huge community of plugins. A lot of the functionality that Jenkins provides is supported by community plugins, which is good and bad. You're going to find like the star teams out there, for the different tools where it's going to integrate into. So ones that maybe aren't so mainstream, you're probably going to find something out there that somebody has worked on at some point. It may not be of the highest quality, but it'll be a start. And if you're into open source and you are into Java web development, you could contribute to that. And the last point there is that it's good and bad. You have basically all the control. You are operating the app. Any backups that are done, because you're taking your reports and storing them in Jenkins. Any backups of those, you are responsible for those. Any updates to Jenkins itself or the server that you're running it on, or all the plugins, because all the plugins are versioned separately, all that's up to you. And also one that I think is somewhat confusing are the runners. So like if you do a normal Jenkins setup, you install it on a computer and you tell it to run something, it's going to run that on the same computer that you installed it on. That's generally not what you want to do. If it's just a personal project and you're doing something for just you, that's probably fine. But as soon as more than one person's using it, you're going to want to connect other either computers or cloud instances to do the execution. So that's in CI land, that's what the runners are. They're the things that are actually running the automation that you've defined for your project. What I missed there, Joe, on Jenkins?
No, I was just kind of reflecting on, we're not here to kind of degrade Jenkins at all. We had the tongue-in-cheek title with the foolish, but I think, it is a free system, and it's fast to set up. And as Brandon has kind of, mentioned, it's a great way to get started. If what you need is a personal system to just do some builds for yourself, and you're not really working in a team, and you're not really doing too much else collaborating, and it's like, I think we just want folks to recognize that there's a difference between using that tool for yourself and then using CI as the way that your company builds and releases quality firmware. Because in one situation, like we talked a little bit about before, when I set up the initial cruise control machine at our old gig, I was running that on an old beat up laptop that I had freed up from doing some other things, and it was sitting on the side of my desk. And when I knew when a build happened, because the fans would spin up and it would go, it sounded like a rocket taking off. You probably have, some people have worked on laptops like that, I'm sure. And so, but the critical thing is this is at a Fortune 500 company. Like that one little laptop with the fan spinning crazy and is probably 10 years old. That was not the build system for thousands and thousands of products worth billions of dollars or whatever. That was I mean, I think anyone would understand that that's crazy. And that's, I think, what's surprising sometimes is we see companies, and Brandon even described how he spent almost a decade managing 20 Jenkins instances for 500 developers, and built a large scale Jenkins implementation. But also described in hindsight, might not have been the right tool. And if he built it today, he'd go a different way. And that's, I think, what we wanted to dig into a little bit here, is just that it is not a bad tool to get started and to do some amazing things very quickly and for free for an individual. But I think our concern is when we see companies who have gone down that road a little bit, and what we see typically happens is they set up a Jenkins instance. It's often an intern sets it up for the summer. Maybe there's several people on the phone who have an intern wrapping up that project right now, or recently wrapped it up since it was just summertime. And what we often see is that it's kind of a little rodshod setup. It's not real reliable. It kind of falls into, over a number of months, it'll fall into disrepair or disuse. It may not be getting updated. It's probably not getting backed up. But the company has the intention of using CI in a really in a production way. They want this to be the way that they build quality into their system. But then you look at kind of, well, we're using kind of like open source tools that are free, and we had our intern set it up, and it's running on that old computer that we got from IT in the corner. And once the intern leaves, nobody's really in charge of maintaining it. Brandon hasn't told this story, but I don't know if you have it later, but he kind of described to me how the pucker factor, maybe I'll say, when they wanted to update the plugins on Jenkins, we got 500 developers worldwide working on like billions of dollars of product, and you're depending on 100 plugins, any one of which may have had an update from some dude. That cool, good for him, great for him. Like, we're not, again, like, we love open source, but there's very few quality checks in a lot of that stuff. And it may just be like, oh yeah, shoot, like I made a bug, but if that bug takes down your 500 person development team, that's not acceptable in most companies.
Right.
And so you guys had to like stage the updates, right? You had to have your own like test system that was like, let's test if this set of 100 plugins works in our system. You had to unit test the CI system almost, right?
Yeah, it was kind of it was more like acceptance testing even.
Sure.
Like we had kind of the canary type jobs that we ran to make sure that we were still getting the same result, something that on the old version of things. So we typically updated the whole stack and tested it. So we had the web server, the hosting the web server, we had the version of Java that we were using, we had the web application, so Jenkins itself, and then all of the plugins we updated. And part of the thing, a lot of times I see people like not update plugins, for example, because they work, right? But the problem with that is that you find a lot of security issues. That's where I was going with that. Mm-hmm. So it's hard when you have a bunch of plugins to not update them when you're concerned about security issues, which both for best practices, we were concerned with that, but also because, we were a bigger company, and our IT organization said, even though this is inside of our firewall, we need to, make sure the right people have access to these things because it's our IP, which makes sense. Sometimes gets frustrating working with IT, but makes sense. So yeah,
that's a typical stance, right? Is that, yep. Keep the stuff updated. And I think even, because the other flip side of that is too, like if a plugin, if you let a plugin lapse and you just say, you know what, works, don't touch it. And at some point, one of these integrations, we were talking about integrations with version control, but there's all kinds of different integration. Most of these plugins are providing different types of integration. And if something about that it, like outside of Jenkins control, it's maybe like the third party tool or the third party, group changes something. Well, the latest version of the plugin is updated, maybe at some point to support that. But now you're talking about, instead of moving from a 3.1 to a 3.2 version of the plugin, you're moving from 1.0 to the 3.2 when you're forced to. And now you're doing a big, huge upgrade that who knows what's going to happen there. So anyway, it just, I think that updating and maintenance piece is just something that we frequently see. It gets tossed onto some engineer's plate. And I think, a lot of times they're saying, like we said at the beginning, I never wanted to be a Java engineer or a Java developer. I don't want to, maintain, I'm not a DevOps person. I don't keep servers up and running. I just wanted CI. And now I'm working extra hours, to like maintain the CI server because we're not staffed appropriately, or we don't have the right key resources in place. So anyway, I think that's kind of all of that was a big reflection on Jenkins, I think. And and again, like if you don't have anything, like do what we did, grab a little laptop that IT is about to throw away and get it going and use Jenkins. But once you're ready to kind of graduate to like actually our department depends on this, or our company depends on this to get things out the door, then that's where I get a little nervous and where we see companies get into trouble.
Yeah, that's a good transition to the next section here, where we'll talk a little bit about, I'll say, generic principles for your CI servers, and we will, then we'll kind of compare that with some of the alternatives CI servers out there, and see that we can work within Jenkins, we can work within different CI servers. A lot of that is because this first principle is that in general, and I've mentioned this, I don't know that I said commodity, but it's really CI servers are commodities. There's different implementations, but for the most part, they're that cron job that's really smart and provides a nice interface for your automation. And your automation is really where you're getting the signals. This is just coordinating all of that together and making sure it works. So it's the mesh and it's the coordinator, and you need it up and running all the time, but you don't need it to, like, at this point in CI server land, you don't need it to be super innovative, I guess, is my point here. Yeah, it's just a really cool cron job. So the second principle, as you're using whatever CI server, that you should think about is that your automated feedback, whatever scripts you have that are running in CI, should also be runnable locally. And some of this comes back to, I'll say, pragmatic reasons. So if you are using your CI server for your actual release builds, which you should be, you don't want to have a surprise up there when you get to that point. You want to be able to see that same sort of feedback locally. And if you have a problem, you want to be able to debug it locally. This is a challenge, and it can be a challenge, but I think it's something, as you're making decisions on how you're choosing a CI server and how you're configuring your automation, that you need to be aware of and err towards the side of, I want stuff that will give me feedback locally on my dev machine and also on CI. The example here is, this is a website for a log parser. This is a Jenkins plugin, very cool Jenkins plugin. You can see kind of, let's see, I think I can, hold on a second here. Yeah, so down here you can see we have a job result. So this is an example of the report that you're getting back from Jenkins after a build. And almost all CI servers are going to take whatever logs that are output to standard error and standard out and save those for you. What the log parser does here is it provides you a way to configure a bunch of regular expressions to say these things are errors in all my logs, these things are warnings, these things are info. And then it does some cool presentation stuff here where you can actually click between all of your errors. You can see them, they're highlighted in different colors, all really cool stuff. But this is a Jenkins plugin. So when you do this build locally, you don't get any of this feedback. And that part, I guess, is annoying that, hey, I made a change and pushed it to the CI server, and now it's telling me there's something that's an error. What goes beyond annoying to me is that you can also configure this plugin to fail your build on any of these things. So locally, I run my compile and I get, a return 0, but I go and push it here and it fails my build, and I can't get my release artifacts. So to me, this is a case where it's not worth this extra, I guess, information that you're getting up here because of the pain that it's going to cause you in, why is my CI system telling me different things than my local builds?
Yeah. And I mean, just digging into the psychology. So like if you're on the cusp of like trying to bring your team up to date and modernize the way that you guys work and bringing in a CI solution of some kind, there's a psychology to this too. And most developers I've worked with, myself included, don't like to feel like they've made a mistake. It's a psychology thing, I think, in engineers. It's just like our work, our as developers, it's our work and our worth is kind of around like, can I do things well and can I do it right the first time? And I think the cultural aspects of rolling out a new tool or a new process within an organization or within even a small department. If you're trying to, bring something new and get people to adopt it and they don't have a way to kind of protect themselves or to kind of like play with it in a safe space, and really I look at it as like, your desk and your own computer, that's your safe space. You can code, you can make mistakes. Oops, I screwed that up. Nobody has to see that I forgot the semicolon for the 80th time or whatever. And when I compiled, right. But when it goes out to CI, the whole point is that you have this big, huge, visual chart of like, yes, it's releasable or no, it's not. And by the way, Brandon just screwed it up. He forgot his semicolon for the 80th time. Like nobody wants like a giant chart saying, like pointing at Brandon saying like he keeps that idiot cannot find his semicolon button. So that's why I feel like, it's even when we rolled stuff out at our old place, but even as we consult and talk with folks, in the current stuff at D5, it's it's not just the tools, I guess, is kind of the point. It's also about the psychology. And that's why this is so important, is making sure that you can run things locally in the same way that you can run them in CI, and making sure that people can feel safe to adopt these new tools. Because otherwise you will hit non-technical, which are the most frustrating for engineers. It's like people, like, why do we have to deal with people, right? But people's feelings matter if you want this to actually stick and take in your organization. And so that's why this is such a big key piece of CI.
Okay, well, let's jump into what are some of the other CI servers out there. I put up 3 examples here. You can see on the right some of the names there, but I guess these are just 3 examples of what I'll say is kind of a common pattern that you'll see in the industry, is that you'll have a SaaS managed commercial tool that basically is, it's a web application that's sitting out somewhere. A lot of times they offer a version that you can run inside your intranet. I'm not a huge fan of those because now you kind of have different problems of running that application, but still you get some of the value that I'm going to talk about here. So all of the maintenance, operation, artifact backup, updates, all of those things are managed by that SaaS platform. So GitHub, Bitbucket, and GitLab all have services that provide the same, commodity CI server functionality that we were talking about with Jenkins. The second bullet there is that they all offer some amount of container-based build runners. So we talked a little bit about Jenkins, how you can use the same computer to host that web application and run your compile, for example, but you don't want to. You want to hook up another computer. It could be a physical computer, it could be a virtual machine, it could be a cloud-based thing, to that, so that you can separate those out. Even Jenkins in their user manual says, don't build on the same computer you're hosting the web application. So the build runners that these provide are managed by them. So they manage the OS there, but you are in a Docker container or a container. And you then have, the good part of that is now I don't manage any of that stuff. The bad part of that is that it does take a little bit of work to figure out how to make a container or how to use an existing container out there for my environment. And unless you then are able to replicate that same sort of workflow locally with a container, you then have to kind of manage the, I'm building in a container up here, maybe I'm building in an IDE directly in my host on my local computer. There are ways to make that better. We'll talk a little bit about what Dojo 5's product is here in a little bit, but it's a good and a bad. I really like the aspect that you don't have to manage that, but the containerization piece is something that people do struggle with, because it's Docker and containers are kind of a new thing for a lot of people.
You've traded like old school DevOps, like managing Tomcat servers for managing Docker files and Docker containers, and that's like the difference in those two problems is you've definitely modernized. It's like 10 steps forward and 1 step back, because containers is, I believe, where not only CI is going to go, but even there's already containerization efforts on embedded. And I think, if it's not literally containers on embedded, the concepts are already there in some cases. You have AB firmware loads and being able to kind of have a bootloader that launches an application that's loaded into a certain place in firmware. That's not quite exactly containers, but it's getting there. And we've already seen that the value in that as a firmware industry for a decade or two, and I think we'll continue to see movement towards that.
Yeah. Yep. And I guess somewhat that's unique to embedded, or compared to like web application development. A lot of even people who are used to working on kind of the front end of a web application will be aware of Docker or use Docker because they are deploying their actual code to a container out in the cloud somewhere. So a lot of the other, I guess, software development professions are more, I would say, Docker aware than embedded. So the last point there, and I think a lot of people discount this or don't see the value if they haven't worked in it before, is that the way that GitHub, Bitbucket, GitLab, and these other SaaS services are distinguishing themselves is by adding, I guess, all kinds of interesting things to the developer workflow, all in this one system. So Git hosting is kind of standard. Jenkins doesn't provide, any version control for you. You connect it to whatever you're running or your corporate is running. But all of these systems start with, hey, here's your version control, here's your CI, and they integrate nicely together. They all have issue management. A lot of times that's pretty lightweight, so that might not work in your corporate environment or your environment, but it is handy to have even for kind of like to-dos sort of things. They all have some sort of a code review workflow where you can see, hey, this branch, somebody wants to merge this branch into this branch, and you can do code review. I would say that used to be like 5 years ago, pretty lightweight, but they're pretty full featured now, the code review aspects. And I already mentioned the cloud runners, and they have build capacity that you do pay for, but you don't have to then manage. So kind of next step from those principles is no matter what CI system you're using, you should do a few things. Keep your CI pipeline definition simple and in source control. Jenkins does provide a way to take your definition of what to do when the code changes, that pipeline definition in source control. It's not the, I guess, the old way. Jenkins used to be all like GUI in the web application. You defined everything. The bad thing with that is that it's not stored with your code. So you don't know like how the actual CI pipeline ran for like an older version of your code. And you don't get the same reviews that you get when it's in your source repo, that sort of thing. So keep it in the text file that your system, they all support some sort of text file, in parallel with your code in your repository. And keep it simple means you should be calling scripts and automation that is in your source control. That's kind of separate, that you could even run without that pipeline file. So you really want to limit the logic in your CI definition. Treat it more, like I said, as a way to specify your cron type information when and how you want to run stuff, kind of one-liner type things, and less a bunch of logic on how you, I guess, are doing everything.
Yeah, we've seen pipeline YAML files that are, I don't know, hundreds of lines long, and that's usually way big. That means there's a lot of logic in there that probably should be in scripts or pushed out. Just something to keep out, because Jenkins files, are the same type of deal, and the same thing there. Keeping all your logic out of the Jenkins file, and then if you get into that habit when you start with Jenkins, then you'll be set on a path for success as you mature out of Jenkins and into something more modern.
Second bullet there is, especially if you're in Jenkins, don't use plugins. It's like a very like black and white statement, and in general, like I'm going to stand by that. You really shouldn't be using plugins. We already talked about the reason for local feedback versus through your CI tool. Jenkins has some other things that are related to things that we talked about, where plugin versions change and maintenance changes over time. It's just, I've seen a lot of people go plugin happy and end up with a system that's just not maintainable. Plugin junkies. Yeah, you just need to step back and see if you can get what you're trying to get without those plugins. Your automation shouldn't be locked into the CI system tool. And the last bullet there is minimize the manual setup on your build runner. We talked about for like the SaaS provided CI systems, they are using Docker, and Docker is kind of your interface on setting up your build environment. So it's very cut and dried. You have a Docker image, and your build, scripts are going to run inside that image, and that's the way it is. If you are instead manually setting up your connection to your build runner for like Jenkins, for example, and you have to manually do a bunch of things on that computer, it's meaning that your development environment is not really controlled. You have a couple computers that are kind of hand rolled, and you're going to have a hard time recreating those builds and having confidence in that you're over time are going to have that same development environment. So I'm not saying you have to use containers, but containers solve that problem very quickly, kind of in one go, because of that interface. So we are here at Dojo 5. Obviously, we care about this stuff, about CI systems and how to integrate embedded systems into CI. We are working on a product called EmbedOps. I'm not going to harp on this, but it's important to us that really we can take embedded teams and get them into CI systems that are going to work for them and not be a pain. And, we are really harping on some of those principles we talked about earlier to jumpstart people into containerized builds that you can do locally and in the web, and getting them started on best practices so that you're not going to run into lock in with your CI system tool, whether it be Jenkins or GitLab or GitHub, and kind of a step into the modern, which is a big deal at Dojo 5. I mean, that's really what Dojo 5 is about, Joe, right?
Yep, you bet. Modernizing firmware.
Yeah. So we are about wrapping up. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat to us, and we'll handle as many as we can here in the last few minutes. I just wanted to kind of end with a little bit about my story. So we talked about cruise control. Like I said, I've worked in Jenkins, and I've helped spin up Jenkins for hundreds of developers. It's still a great tool, but I think in most contexts now, people should be moving to SaaS provided CI systems. They have a lot of value that you don't get in Jenkins. So kind of parting thoughts, focus on the value of a CI system, that it's a really cool cron job. Don't get too distracted by, like I said, the plugins or all the other things. Make sure that you're getting what you need in terms of running stuff when you want it to run, getting the feedback and the notifications, and storing your reports and artifacts. I mean, it's pretty simple when you think about it like that. Number two, keep your automated feedback independent of your CI system. That automated feedback is really the star. That's something that's not a commodity. Getting the feedback on your system is something that you want your team to be working on. You don't want them to be working on how do I maintain this web application. That's pretty much a solved problem. Getting the feedback on your system, whether it's improving your hardware in the loop testing or static analysis or unit testing in a virtual environment, those are the things that you can't go out and just buy off the shelf. So focus on that star. And when you're making your selection, don't forget about the maintenance and operations risk for running that web application. So with that, we will handle any questions in the chat.
I did want to Q&A.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, what were you going to say? Sorry
to. I wanted to leave this up here. This is a few links back to Dojo 5 information. The top one, there's actually a blog post that's related to this whole webinar. So if you go to the blog, you'll see that. You'll also see a lot of articles on getting quality automated feedback on your systems for embedded. And we also have a link there for EmbedOps. And then next month's webinar is coming up with Joe Perrin and Joe Schneider talking about embedded command line interfaces.
Yeah, I don't know, it'll be a little more kind of deep dive into some more code than a couple of our more recent webinars. But yeah, it'll be really fun. Yeah, so a couple of questions here. Ivan asked, what do we mean by coverage in this context? And I think he asked it when we were on the page where you had all the badges. And that's just pretty simple answer is code coverage. So this is like typically what you do is it's code coverage during unit tests. And so it means like, my unit tests have covered all of the lines of code. And sometimes you even get branch level coverage, which is like I've covered, like for an if statement, it can either be true or false. Have I covered both sides of that? Or even if you get even more detailed within an if statement, is there multiple conditions to make that pass, and then you can kind of see if you've covered all of those conditions. So it gives you confidence that your tests have covered a majority of code. I'd say that it is actually a somewhat controversial metric. Some people like to go to 100%, and that often is difficult. And there's I think a strong argument to say that when you go to 100%, you have a lot of very low value tests that you have to write, testing a lot of stuff that isn't likely to break. But then I think we all know that 0% is also a bad number. So you need that's an interesting, I think, a place where there's some opportunity for innovation. How do I write the right tests, and how do I cover the right things? So yeah, hopefully that answers your question, Ivan, of what we meant by coverage there. Code coverage, gcov, if you need some, you could go look at that. There's also some proprietary tools out there that'll do code coverage for you. So, just look up embedded code coverage. I think you'll find a lot of stuff there. And then Abid Hussein, hopefully I said that right, asked about any gotchas when you typically run into when moving Jenkins to Bitbucket pipelines. He just set up Jenkins to build a Yocto firmware system. Yeah, I think, and you can. Do you want to comment on this one first, Brandon? Or
yeah. So I guess probably the first thing to mention is what I was talking about earlier, that Dockerized builds are kind of the standard way that let's see, you said Bitbucket there. Yeah, Bitbucket is going to assume that you want to do a Dockerized build, so in a Docker container. So that's one thing that I guess you'd run into right away is the, how do I get my environment, whether it's Linux, I guess it's Yocto, probably Linux, but what build image do I use, and does it have the same things as I'm using locally when I build it in this Jenkins setup?
Yeah, you have to containerize your build environment for Yocto, and then Yocto is a beast. It, as you probably know, and as anyone who's used Yocto probably knows, it's build times of 3 to 4 hours can be pretty normal. It takes gigs, tens of gigs sometimes, depending on how your image is configured to build. And I would say that you'll pretty quickly also run into an issue with Bitbucket where the shared runners, the runners that they manage that are in the cloud, will have limitations that you'll probably hit pretty quickly, where you won't actually be able to complete a build. And so that's another reason where it's just like, geez, Jenkins is so easy. I just have a dedicated server sitting right here and run it. But one nice kind of intermediate step there would be to move to Bitbucket. But then instead of running Jenkins on your machine that you have locally, run the Bitbucket runner on your machine locally. And then you can kind of make the transition to, now you've got like a production level CI system running, and but you still have to manage this one box, but it's really just the environment. That can get you, that's like a nice step, but don't stop there. And get that running, get that working, get some comfort with that, and then you move to a Docker or not a Dockerized environment, but
like a cloud build environment.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Like
then you move your runners
something
to the cloud. Yeah, and that'll be cheaper to maintain, and that'll be ultimately a more highly available, more production ready kind of environment. So I'd take a two-step process there.
Yeah, that's something we didn't talk about, Joe, was that all of the GitLab, Bitbucket, those systems have really good support now of, a lot of times they call them like local runners.
Self-hosted runners. Yeah.
Self-hosted runners, right. So instead of getting the value of the shared runner that you don't have to worry about at all, you do have to, configure something on your hardware, whether it's in the cloud or, real hardware. But you don't have to manage the web application piece of that. And so you do get a lot of that value. That's a good point.
Yeah. All right. We got one from Luis, who is asking about any examples on implementing CI Jenkins for data pipelines. And I'm not. So data pipelines, do we mean like data processing? I maybe need a little more info there, but ultimately Jenkins is like Brandon said, just a glorified cron runner. and you kind of, if you want some command to be executed on a regular basis, whether it's like on a time basis or when you make commits to maybe you got a big corpus of data up in a version control system somewhere. I've worked on some medical systems where they're ML based, AI based stuff where they have a big, huge chunk of data and they need to run a bunch of algorithms against it to test whether the algorithm works. Like say you're trying to detect a heartbeat and you've written an algorithm that detects an heartbeat. There are corpuses of data out there, 10,000, 100,000 different heartbeat recordings, and they're tagged as like, this one has some problems with it or this one's normal, and you can run your algorithm against it and see if you match. So that's getting used a lot as especially as AI and ML and all this training data, just like big data type of problems are hitting, and yeah, Jenkins can solve that, and it can run that. I think again, I think my takeaway would just be is running that correctly core to your business. And if it is, or like critical to your business being successful, and if it is, I would question whether like a self-hosted Jenkins instance locally is the right, option for that, because you could also fairly easily get something like that running in a more larger environment. But hey, if you're just playing around and you just want it locally for yourself or a really small business or something, then like that could be a great solution. Anything else to add there, Brandon?
No, I think that's true. And I think the other question I see here is from Yvonne, which is maybe somewhat similar. Can embedded CI trigger an OTA? And, like Joe was saying, there's no magic really in Jenkins or GitLab or Bitbucket in terms of it's a cron job. So if you have a way to execute that OTA or initiate that OTA in an automatic fashion, with a script or whatever, then yeah, it can trigger that. And there's some value in being able to use it from one of these systems, because then you do get like a log of, hey, this happened. This is the, whatever results that I got, I can store those in the system. It gives you, the ability to do things like do it on a schedule or whatever, compared to just running it manually.
And I'd say I think a lot of places want to get to that point. But you really got to make it. In the web world, if you deploy something to a web server and it's broken, beyond all recognition, redeploying is usually not too big of a deal. I mean, it's probably still like a all hands on deck situation for that company to get their website back up and running, but you can do it. The trick with firmware and embedded, of course, is like if you push out an OTA, additional OTAs better work. And so because you can turn those devices into bricks, and then you have to physically like visit them or have them sent back or something. And that's you got to make sure before you do that you've got a quality system in place to ensure that they never become bricks. And that is, I think, the key that some companies really struggle with. If you've got 10,000, 100,000 devices out in the wild, and you are setting up a CI system to automatically push OTA, you better be really 100% confident in your OTA setup. And some companies just aren't quite there yet. We'd like to be part of the solution to getting more and more companies into that situation where they do feel really confident. But I would say majority of the industry isn't there yet.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I'll just wrap up with like I mentioned earlier, we do have another webinar next month. So please come join again. If you have more questions, you can get our contact information off of the dojo5.com and EmbedOps Learn More link there and get a hold of us. This is fun stuff for us to talk about. So yeah, like I said, if you're interested in it and want to talk about it more, go ahead and get in contact with us.
Thank you.